Good morning, friends. The scope of his concepts of the world can be judged by the fact that he believed there was a Canadian language. During the course of 2 months in the cell, he did not read a single book, not even a whole page, and if he did read a paragraph, it was only to be distracted from his gloomy thoughts about his interrogation. It was clear from his conversation that he had read even less in freedom. He knew of Pushkin as the hero of bawdy stories, and of Tolstoy he knew only, in all probability, that he was a deputy of the Supreme Soviet. On the other hand, was he a 100% loyal communist? Was he that same socially conscious proletarian who had been brought up to replace Polchinski and von Meck in their ilk? This is what was really surprising. He was most certainly not. We once discussed the whole course of the war with him, and I said that from the very first moment I had never had any doubts about our victory over the Germans. He looked at me sharply. He did not believe me. "Come on, what are you saying?" And then he shook his head in his hands. "Oh, Sasha, Sasha!" And I was convinced the Germans would win. That's what did me in. There you are. He was one of the organizers of victory, but each day he believed in the German success and awaited their inevitable arrival. Not because he loved them, but simply because he had so sober an insight into our economy, which I of course knew nothing about and therefore believed in. All of us in the cell were deeply depressed, but none of us were so crushed as him. None took his arrest so profound a tragedy. He knew from us that he would get no more than a tenner. He learned from us that he would get no more than a tenner. That during his years in camp he would of course be a work superintendent, and that he would not have to experience real suffering, as indeed he never did. But this did not comfort him in the least. He was too stricken by the collapse of such a glorious life. After all, it was his one and only life on earth, and no one else's, which had interested him all his 36 years. And more than once, sitting on his cot in front of the table, propping his pudgy head on his short pudgy arm, he would start to sing quietly, in a sing-song voice and with lost, befogged eyes. Forgotten and abandoned since my young early years, I was left a tiny orphan. He could never get any further than that. At that point he would break into explosive sobs. All that bursting strength which could not break through the walls that enclosed him he turned inward toward self-pity, and toward pity for his wife. Every 10th day, since oftener was not allowed, his wife, long since unloved, brought him rich and bountiful food parcels, the whitest of white bread, butter, red caviar, veal, sturgeon. He would give each of us a sandwich and a twist of tobacco, and then bend down to the provisions he had set before himself, delighting in odors and colors that contrasted vividly with the bluish potatoes of the old underground revolutionary Festenko. Then his tears would start to pour again, redoubled. He recalled out loud his wife's tears, whole years of tears, some due to love notes she had found in his trousers, some to some woman's underpants in his overcoat pocket, stuffed there hurriedly in his automobile and forgotten. And when he was thus torn by burning self-pity, his armor of evil energy fell away, and before us was a ruined and clearly a good person. I was astonished that he could sob so. The Estonian Arnold Susi, our cellmate with the grey bristles in his hair, explained it to me. Cruelty is invariably accompanied by sentimentality. It is the law of complementaries. For example, in the case of the Germans, the combination is a national trait. Festenko, on the other hand, was the most cheerful person in the cell, even though, in view of his age, he was the only one who could not count on surviving and returning to freedom. Flinging an arm around my shoulders, he would say, "To stand up for the truth is nothing. For truth you have to sit in jail." Or else he taught me to sing this song from Tsarist hard labor days. And if we have to perish in mines and prisons wet, our cause will ever find renown in future generations yet. And I believe this. May these pages help his faith come true. The 16-hour days in our cell were short on outward events, but they were so interesting that I, for example, now find a mere 16 minutes wait for a trolley bus much more boring. There were no events worthy of attention, and yet by evening I would sigh because once more there had not been enough time, once more the day had flown. The events were trivial, but for the first time in my life I learned to look at them through a magnifying glass. The most difficult hours in the day were the first 2, the rattle of the key in the lock, for at the Lubyanka there were no swine troughs, and it was necessary to unlock the door, even to shout, "Time to get up." We jumped up without lingering, made our beds, and sat down on them feeling empty and helpless, with the electric light still burning. This enforced wakefulness from 6 a.m. on, at a time when the brain was still lazy from sleep, and the whole world seemed repulsive and all of life wrecked. And there was not a gulp of air in the cell. It was particularly ludicrous for those who had been under interrogation all night, and had only just been able to get to sleep. But don't try to steal extra sleep. If you should try to doze off, leaning slightly against the wall, or propped over the table as if studying the chessboard, or relaxing over a book lying conspicuously open on your knees, the key would sound a warning knock on the door. Or worse yet, the door with that rattling lock would suddenly open silently, since the Lubyanka jailers were specially trained to do just that, and like a spirit passing through a wall, the swift and silent shadow of the junior sergeant would take 3 steps into the cell, hook onto you as you slept, and maybe take you off to the punishment cell. Or maybe they would take book privileges away from the whole cell, or deprive everyone of their daily walk. A cruel, unjust punishment for all. And there were other punishments, too, in the black lines of the prison regulations. Read them. They hang in every cell. If, incidentally, you needed glasses to read, then you wouldn't be reading books or the sacred regulations either during those 2 starving hours. Eyeglasses were taken away every night, and it was evidently still dangerous for you to have them during those 2 hours when no one brought anything to the cell, and no one came to it. No one asked about anything, and no one was summoned. The interrogators were still sleeping sweetly, and the prison administration was just opening its eyes, coming to. Only the vertukai, the turnkeys, were active and energetic, opening the peephole cover once a minute for inspection. But one procedure was carried out during those 2 hours, the morning trip to the toilet. When the guard roused us, he made an important announcement. He designated the person from our cell who was to be entrusted with the responsibility of carrying out the latrine bucket. In more isolated, ordinary prisons, the prisoners had enough freedom of speech and self-government to decide this question for themselves. But in the chief political prison, such an important event could not be left to chance. So then you formed up in single file, hands behind your backs, and at the head of the line the responsible latrine bucket bearer carried chest high the 2-gallon tin pail with a lid on it. When you reached your goal, you were locked in again, each having first been handed a small piece of paper, the size of 2 railway tickets. At the Lubyanka this was not particularly interesting. The paper was blank and white. But there were enticing prisons where they gave you pages of books, and what reading that was! You could try to guess whence it came, read it over on both sides, digest the contents, evaluate the style. And when words had been cut in half, that was particularly essential. You could trade with your comrades. In some places they handed out pages from once progressive Granite Encyclopedia, and sometimes, it's awful to say it, from the classics. And I don't mean belles lettres either. Visits to the toilet thus became a means of acquiring knowledge. And there's not that much to laugh at. We are dealing with that crude necessity which it is considered unsuitable to refer in literature. Although there, too, it has been said with immortal adroitness, blessed is he who early in the morning, this allegedly natural start of the prison day, set a trap for the prisoner who would grip him all day, a trap for his spirit, which was what hurt. Given the lack of physical activity in prison, and the meager food, and the muscular relaxation of sleep, a person was just not able to square accounts with nature immediately after rising. Then they quickly returned you to the cell and locked you up until 6 p.m., or in some prisons until morning. At that point, you would start to get worried and worked up by the approach of the daytime interrogation period and the events of the day itself, and you would be loading yourself up with your bread ration and water and gruel. But no one was going to let you visit that glorious accommodation again, easy access to which free people are incapable of appreciating. This debilitating, banal need could make itself felt day after day shortly after the morning toilet trip, and would then torment you the whole day long, oppress you, rob you of the inclination to talk, read, think, and even of any desire to eat the meager food. People in the cells sometimes discussed how the Lubyanka system and schedule, and those in other prisons as well, had come into being, whether through calculated brutality or as a matter of chance. My opinion is that both factors are involved. The rising time is, obviously, a matter of malicious intent, but much of the rest evolved automatically at first, which is true of many of the brutalities of life generally, and was then discovered by the powers that be to be useful, and was therefore made permanent. The shifts change at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. and it was more convenient for everyone to take the prisoners to the toilet at the end of a shift. Letting them out singly in the middle of the day was extra trouble and meant extra precautions, and no one got paid for that. The same was true of the business of eyeglasses. Why should one worry about that at 6 a.m.? They could be returned to the owners just before the end of the shift instead. So now we heard them being brought around, doors were being opened. We could guess whether someone wore them in the cell next door, and didn't your co-defendant wear spectacles? We didn't feel up to knocking out a message on the wall. This was punished very severely. A moment later they would bring the eyeglasses to our cell. Festenko used them only for reading, but Susie needed them all the time. He could not stop squinting once he put them on. Thanks to his horn-rimmed glasses and straight lines above the eyes, his face became severe. Perspicacious. Exactly the face of an educated man, of our century as we might picture it to ourselves. Back before the Revolution, he had studied at the Faculty of History and Philology of the University of Petrograd, and throughout his 20 years in independent Estonia, he had preserved intact the purest Russian speech, which he spoke like a native. Later, in Tartu, he had studied law. In addition to Estonian, he spoke English and German, and through all these years he continued to read the London Economist and the German scientific Bericht summaries. He had studied the constitutions and the codes of law of various countries, and in our cell he represented Europe worthily and with restraint. He had been a leading lawyer in Estonia and had been known as Koldzu, meaning golden tongue. There was new activity in the corridor. A freeloader in a grey smock, a husky young fellow who had certainly not been at the front, brought a tray with our 5 bread rations and 10 lumps of sugar. Our cell... Is that right? Yeah. Our cell stoolie hovered over them, even though we would inevitably cast lots for them, which we did because every least detail of this was important. The heel of the loaf, for instance, and the number of smaller pieces needed to make the total weight come out right, and how the crust adheres or doesn't to the inside of the bread. And it was better that fate should decide. But the stoolie felt that he just had to hold everything in his hands for at least a second so that some bread and sugar molecules would cling to his palms. That pound of unrisen wet bread, with its swamp-like sogginess of texture, made half with potato flour, was our crutch and main event of the day. Life had begun. The day had begun. This was when it began, and everyone had countless problems. Had he allocated his bread ration wisely the day before? Should he cut it with a thread, or break it up greedily, or slowly, quietly nip off pieces one by one? Should he wait for tea, or pile it into right now? Should he leave some for dinner, or finish it off at lunch, and how much? In addition to these wretched dilemmas, what wide-ranging discussions and arguments went on, for our tongues had been liberated, and with bread we were once more men. Provoked by this 1-pound chunk in our hand, consisting more of water than grain. Incidentally, Festenko explained that the workers of Moscow were eating the very same bread at that time. And generally speaking, was there any real bread grain in this bread at all? And what additives were in it? There was at least one person in every cell who knew all about additives, for after all, who hadn't eaten them during these past decades? Discussions and reminiscences began about the white bread they had baked back in the 20s, springy round loaves like sponge cake inside, with a buttery reddish-brown top crust and a bottom crust that still had a trace of ash from the coals of the hearth. That bread had vanished for good. Those born in 1930 would never know what bread is. Friends, this is a forbidden subject. We agreed not to say one word about food. Once again there was a movement in the corridor. Tea was being brought around, and a new young tough in a grey smock carrying pails. We put our teapot out in the corridor, and he poured straight into it from a pail without a spout, into the teapot and onto the runner and the floor beneath, and the whole corridor was polished like that of a first-class hotel. And that was all they gave us. Whatever cooked food we got would be served at 1 p.m. and at 4 p.m., one meal almost on the heels of the other. You could then spend the next 21 hours remembering it. And that wasn't prison brutality either. It was simply a matter of the kitchen staff having to do its work as quickly as possible and leave. At 9 o'clock the morning check-up took place. For a long while beforehand we could hear especially loud turns of the key and particularly sharp knocks on the doors. Then one of the duty lieutenants for the whole floor would march forward and enter, almost as erect as if he were standing at attention. He would take 2 steps forward and look sternly at us. We would be on our feet. We didn't even dare remember that political prisoners were once not required to rise. It was no work at all to count us. He could do it in a glance. And this was a moment for testing our rights. For we did have some rights, after all, although we did not really know them, and it was his job to hide them from us. The whole strength of the Lubyanka training showed itself in a totally machine-like manner, no expression on the face, no inflection, not a superfluous word. And with each of our rights, and which of our rights did we know about? A request to have our shoes repaired, an appointment with the doctor, although if they actually took you to the doctor, you would not be happy about the consequences. There the machine-like Lubyanka manner would be particularly striking. He didn't ask, "What's your trouble?" That would be too many words, and one couldn't pronounce the phrase without an inflection. He would ask curtly, "Troubles?" If you began to talk at too great length of your ailment, he would cut you off. It was clear anyway. A toothache, extract it. You could have arsenic. A filling? We don't fill teeth here. That would have required additional appointments and created a somewhat humane atmosphere. The prison doctor was the interrogator's and executioner's right-hand man. The beaten prisoner would come to on the floor, only to hear the doctor's voice. "You can continue, the pulse is normal." After a prisoner's 5 days and nights in a punishment cell, the doctor inspects the frozen naked body and says, "You can continue." If a prisoner is beaten to death, he signs the death certificate, cirrhosis of the liver, or a coronary occlusion. He gets an urgent call to a dying prisoner in a cell, and he takes his time, and whoever behaves differently is not kept on in the prison. But our stoolie was better informed about his rights. According to him, he had already been under interrogation 11 months, and he was taken to interrogation only during the day. He spoke up and asked for an appointment with the prison chief. The chief of the whole Lubyanka? Yes, his name was taken down, and in the evening after taps, when the interrogators were already in their offices, he was summoned, and he returned with some makorka. This was very crude, of course, but so far they had not been able to think up anything better. It would have been a big expense to convert entirely to microphones in the walls, and impossible to listen in on all 111 cells for whole days at a time. Who would do it? Stool pigeons were cheaper and would continue to be used for a long time to come. But Kramarenko had a hard time with us. Sometimes he eavesdropped so hard that the sweat poured from him, and we could see from his face that he didn't understand what we were saying. There was one additional right, the privilege of writing applications and petitions, which replaced freedom of the press of assembly, and of the ballot, all of which we had lost when we left freedom. Twice a month the morning duty officer asked, "Who wants to write a petition?" And they listed everyone who wanted to. In the middle of the day they would lead you to an individual box and lock you up in it. And there you could write whomever you pleased, the Father of the Peoples, the Central Committee of the Party, the Supreme Soviet, Minister Beria, Minister Abakumov, the General Prosecutor, the Chief Military Prosecutor, the Prison Administration, the Investigation Department. You could complain about your arrest, your interrogator, even the chief of the prison. In each and every case your petition would have no effect whatever. It would not be stapled to any file, and the most senior official to read it would be your own interrogator. However, you were in no position to prove this. In fact, it was rather more likely that he would not read it, because no one would be able to read it. On a piece of paper measuring 7 by 10 centimeters, in other words 3 by 4 inches, a little larger than the paper given you each morning at the toilet, and with a pen broken in the middle or bent into a hook, and an inkwell with pieces of rag in it, and ink diluted with water, and you would just be able to scratch out petit. Then the letters would all run together on the cheap paper. Yun couldn't be worked into the line, and everything would come through on the other side of the sheet. You might have still other rights, but the duty officer would keep quiet about them, and you wouldn't be losing much, truth to tell, even if you didn't find out about them. The checkup came and went, and the day began. The interrogators were already arriving there somewhere. The turnkey would summon one of us with a great air of secrecy. He called out the first letter of the name only. Like this: whose name begins with S, and whose name begins with F, or perhaps whose begins with M, or am, and you yourself had to be quick-witted enough to recognize that it was you he wanted and offer yourself as a victim. This system was introduced to prevent mistakes on the jailer's part. He might have called out a name in the wrong cell, and that way we might have found out who else was in prison. And yet, though cut off from the entire prison, we were not deprived of news from other cells. Because they tried to crowd in as many prisoners as possible, they shuffled them about from cell to cell, and every newcomer brought all his accumulated experience to his new cell. Thus it was that we, imprisoned on the 4th floor, knew all about the cellar cells, about the boxes on the 1st floor, about the darkness on the 2nd floor, where the women were all kept, about the split-level arrangement of the 5th, and about the biggest cell of all in the 5th floor, number 111. Before my time, the children's writer, Bondarin, had been a prisoner in our cell, and before that he had been on the women's floor with some Polish correspondent or other, who had previously been a cellmate of Field Marshal von Paulus. And that was how we learned all the details about von Paulus. Have a good day, friends.